Today we're going to start with the fundamental question of this course, and that is, what is graphic design? Just like what you've learned about in your other communications courses, graphic design is a form of communication. In this case, though, we're using a visual element to get a message across. And just as in all of our other communications courses and projects, that message has to be carefully crafted. We need to know what we're saying, who we're saying it to, what the purpose of it is. And all those things have to be taken into consideration before we actually start crafting our message. This is one of the issues that has arisen in the age of computer graphics. It is so easy now for anyone to throw together a graphic very quickly, but that doesn't mean it's a good graphic. It also doesn't mean it's a usable graphic. Sometimes messages can actually confuse the viewer rather than enlighten them. And that's the last thing we want to happen. So think of yourself like an architect in this class. You wouldn't start working on a building until you knew what its purpose was, how much space you have, what materials were at hand, and so on. And same thing here. We need to do good planning. We need to be deliberate about it. And we need to make sure that the information we're going to present is usable. Perhaps the easiest way to see what good design is by looking at examples of bad design. In this first example, it's a little confusing as to what exactly is on offer. Is it a new app for my phone? Is it a place to rent? Or am I renting ships or ice? I'm just not really sure. And the thing that's really disturbing about this is actually it's a job offer for people to become apprentices at a graphic design firm. You would think of all possible job ads, the one for a job at a graphic design firm would show some thought about what the ad looked like. But yeah, that didn't happen here. And unfortunately, it's not hard to find many other examples like this. For instance, this handbag was sure to cause a sensation wherever you went with it, because first, who knew Hitler was a color? And second, what kind of person picks Hitler as their favorite color? Well, fortunately, the designer of this took notice of all the criticism and changed things around so it actually was easy to see their intention, which was a bag that says my favorite color is glitter. And our final example here is this third one, which seems to show some festive holiday lights that are not quite safe for the kids. Probably the best way to make sure that you don't end up with designs that look like crap is by remembering the word crap, because actually the first letters of our four main principles of design are C-R-A-P. That is contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. So we're going to try to incorporate all of these into every design we do, starting with contrast. So contrast is just what it sounds like. We don't want to have every element of the design be so similar to every other that there's nothing that grabs our reader's attention. We need to use contrast to show the reader that certain things are more important than other things, and we need to show contrast to help move the reader's eye. Now we can create contrast in a variety of ways. We can contrast sizes, we can contrast positions, we can contrast colors, we can contrast textures, shapes, or orientation. A key thing to keep in mind is that when we're doing contrast, we want to have a very pronounced contrast. We don't want to have items in our design that are kind of sort of different from other items. We want them to be very different. We also want the items to at the same time feel like they belong together. So we don't want to have a whole mess of different things, because that is just as confusing as having no contrast whatsoever. To see the principle of contrast in action, take a look at these examples. You'll notice that the ones on the left are marked good contrast and the ones on the right are marked bad contrast. If you look at them carefully, you'll see why. The examples on the left are very clearly representing a wide range of tonality, from very dark to very light, whereas the ones on the right are kind of all in the middle range. The same thing with colors. The ones on the left have some colors that really pop. Very deep blacks, very deep reds. And again, on the right, we're looking at examples that just don't have a lot of range between the brights and the duller parts. I would also recommend you spend some time going to this link on canva.com. It'll really give you a thorough grounding in ways to use contrast. Canva.com is a site we're going to use for some projects later in the semester, and it has a wide range of resources we can use to create design and learn design principles. We now come to our second letter in our CRAP principles, which is repetition. On first thought, this might seem to be contradictory. How can you have repetition if you are trying to get contrast? But actually, they can be very complementary to each other. Repetition is important because we have to have a consistency in our design. Again, we just don't want to throw a bunch of random elements on a page and call that a design. And so we're going to repeat things like font or colors or other design elements that will help unify the whole document together. And so you'll see, for instance, especially when we talk about branding later on, this is really critical to give an identity to a company, to a person, to a service, that there's got to be a way that we will be able to identify this entity through its branding. And you also see how we can tie together elements of a package with repetition in this other example. Our third principle is alignment, and this also is important for unity. We don't want to just place elements on the page arbitrarily. Everything on the page should be connected with something else on the page. And so you'll see, for example, in this business card, the initial example on the left has elements of the address that are kind of aligned on the bottom line, but then they're also kind of not aligned with the left and right margins. And it's really difficult to figure out what exactly is going with what. In the redesign on the right, it's very clear that this card is for someone who works at Mermaid Tavern, that this is his name, and that this is his contact information. So that's the type of idea that we want to use alignment for. Now, generally speaking, there are 4 types of alignment. Flush left, everything is lined up on the left. Flush right, just the opposite, everything lined up on the right. We don't see an example here, but in text in print, we often see justified, which is both flush left and flush right. It doesn't look great in a lot of designs because the way we create that is by sticking a lot of extra space between words. That doesn't mean you won't use it, but it's not as common as flush left or flush right. And then we have centered. Now, I'm not sure why exactly, but every beginning design student thinks that everything should be centered. And this is actually not a good idea. We're not trained to read centered text. We're trained to read from left to right. And if you're going to use centered text at all, only use it for short pieces of type. And make sure there's an obvious clarity that this is centered on purpose. If you look at the final paragraph on this page, it's really not sure to the readers whether that was intentional or not. So rules to keep in mind: make sure that everything aligns with something else. Pick one alignment per page and stick with it. And really try to stay away from the centered text. The number one idea that centered text conveys is, I'm an amateur. Finally, over at printwand.com, there's a very helpful magazine to get you through more in-depth information on the principles of alignment. I highly recommend you check it out. And now we come to our fourth and final design principle, which is proximity. Proximity means a nearness or a closeness, and that's what we're talking about here. You've actually seen this in play in some of the examples we've already looked at. We want to make sure that items that belong together are seen together as one unit or one group. And this again gives a coherence to our page. On the other hand, we don't want to have things that do not belong together be close together, because that would imply a false relationship between them. Now, if we look at this example, we can see something that at first glance is very confusing, because we have the same amount of space between pretty much every element on the page. And so therefore it's hard to figure out what is exactly going with what. If we look at the redesign of it, we've done a couple of things here. One of which is to change the graphic element itself to a more prominent position and to get rid of all that crazy centered text and give us a flush left text. But the other, from the standpoint of proximity, is we've grouped together each little headline with the text that it belongs with. And you should be able to see that this is much easier for us to follow along the way. Now, once again, there's a good tutorial for you over at sitepoint.com. I highly recommend you check this out. And once you've done that, if you've gone through the other readings in this video as well, you should be fairly confident that you're going to do well on our upcoming assignments in the class.